Well, it's always a good time for an Easter sermon. I mean, after all, every Sunday is a day of resurrection. Oh, I can't keep it in. I can't keep it in. I gotta let it out. I gotta show the world's gotta see all the love that's in me. Oh, my favorite Easter song. Thank you to Cat Stevens. The woman at the well. It's one of the greatest stories in all of the four Gospels. She's an outcast, a sinner. We know this because she's at the well in the middle of the day alone. She's not in the company of a bunch of women, her community, who would have gone to the well in the cool of the morning or the cool of the early evening. She's by herself, alone, when Jesus approaches. She's had too many husbands, and the man she lives with now is not even her husband. She's a sinner in the eyes of her community and an outcast. She's probably very lonely, pushed away from her own family and her friends and her neighbors, living a life of solitude. Jesus speaks to her about living water. She wonders, is it practical? Because she really would like some of that living water, if it's true. But for Jesus, of course, it's an image. We'd call it a metaphor. He says, the water that I will give will become in them a spring of water, gushing up to an eternal life. The conversation is intimate. They wrangle with theological issues between Samaritans and Jews, but they lean into the conversation. They enjoy each other's company. Then a point of crisis arrives. The disciples return and find him speaking with a woman to whom he's not related, alone, at a well. And she is an outcast woman, and she is a Samaritan, But Jesus holds his ground. And eventually, he spends 2 more days with the people of her city. I always imagine what those 2 days must have been like. This woman is obviously in the presence of a man who can beat back death. He shows her this with his love, with his acceptance, with the grace of God. You see, even before the Easter event, the crucified and risen part of our creed, the rising was already happening. Love was rising in that woman's life. The death in her life, known through shame and broken relationships, trauma and grief, was pushed back, beat down, and conquered through Jesus. The rising is a compelling image for a tidal people. We are a tidal people. We live on the shores of the Great Salish Sea. We watch as the tides rise up and then decrease every single day. You can see it in the harbor, on English Bay, or on the Fraser River. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. We are a tidal people, affected in ways we cannot even imagine by the rising and lowering of the tidal system. I watched and walked and explored and played in this tidal shift at Rathtrevor Beach this summer. I watched the water retreat, and then I watched it rise. The rising of the Christ is like this. When the tide is out, we see very few signs of life. There were thousands of little snails just lying all around in the barren sand. You could hardly walk without stepping on them. I wondered how they're doing with the sun beating down on them on the empty, barren sand. But the tide came again, bringing new life, nourishment, and sustenance. As the tide is about to shift, you can actually hear bubbling from inside of all the little holes on the sand, bubbling from the pressure of the tide coming in. All the holes on the beach go snap, crackle, and pop. It sounds just like Rice Krispies. Life returning. Snap, crackle, pop. As the people of the rising, we know that our days and the world around us can seem barren and calm and lifeless at times, like a moonscape for our hearts. But we also know that new life rises. As a tidal people, we know that new life arrives over and over and over again. As an Easter people, we know that death does not win. And with this understanding that death does not win, this belief strongly rooted in our hearts, we can change people's lives just like Jesus and the woman at the well and so many in her city so long ago. Now, I'm preaching this sermon much earlier than I normally would. It's August 21st. 2 days ago, Cincinnati Reds announcer Tom Brenneman made a homophobic slur over the airwaves. I don't think he knew that he had turned his mic back on or that he was on the air. And I wonder what the conversation was in the booth during the break that his comment was a response to. I don't think it was just Tom who was being homophobic. This is death dealing, folks. This is the kind of comment young lesbian, gay, transgendered, and queer people have had to hear in locker rooms, gymnasiums, and the field of play far too often. It is the kind of comment that has made them walk away from sports, kept them in the closet, reinforced a sense of shame, and reinforced the historic message that they do not belong. And more times than we like to account for, the constant offhand remarks, jokes, and slurs have tragically led to suicide. Reverend Deb's friend, CBC Sports correspondent Devin Heroux, wrote courageously this week about his own journey as a gay kid in the hockey world and how he left the sport because of the toxic environment, but later discovered a love for sports writing. He wrote of the slurs he has heard throughout the sport world and the gut-wrenching efforts on his life as a teenager and a young adult. The Cincinnati Reds organization immediately registered their disgust with the comments, and the Reds pitcher, Amir Garrett, tweeted these powerful words, and I'm quoting, "To the LGBTQ community, just know that I am with you, and whoever is against you is against me. I'm sorry for what was said today," unquote. Whoever is against you is against me. What a brilliant passage of allyship. What a sense that death does not win. The good news is that our world has shifted, and the outrage at the broadcaster's comments were swift and definitive. The tide came back in, bringing with it hope for a better way forward. The comments by Amir Garrett are life-bringing. Although it's just one small gesture, his words of support and allyship help change the conversation. They allow the rising of God's love to occur in even one lesbian, gay, trans, or queer kid. If just one hears them, they allow the rising of God's love to occur. The swift reaction of the employer and the public outrage of so many tells these kids that death does not win. The tide shifts and new life arrives. This is the message we are to profess. As Christians, we proclaim Jesus crucified and risen. It has to mean something. We are called to understand the true meaning of the rising, not a one-time event, the true meaning of God's death-defying love in the world. And more importantly, we are called to share it, encourage it, and stand for it by standing with those who have been shut out, put down, and pushed away. This is what we profess. It is our creed, and this is how we should live. May it be so. Amen.